Buenos días, van entrando.
Good morning, good morning.
Bueno, muy buenos
Good
días y
morning.
bienvenidos
Good
al
morning and
tercer
welcome
seminario
to the third
de la serie Ciudades
seminar
más productivas y
on the
seguras en
more
América Latina y el
productive and
Caribe.
more
Mi
safe and
nombre es María
productive
Camila Uribe,
cities.
soy coordinadora
My
de
name is Maria
comunicaciones
Camila
y
Uribe.
les damos
I'm
la más
director
cordial
of the
bienvenida el día de hoy.
IDB Session of
Hoy
Jobs.
abordaremos el rol de los
Today,
gobiernos
we will
locales
address
en
the role of
impulsar
local
la formación
governments in
laboral y la
driving
generación
job
de empleo
training
en las
and the
ciudades.
creation of
Y
jobs in the
conoceremos
cities.
los
And
casos
with
y
this, we will get to
experiencias
know the
de
cases or the
Bogotá y de
experiences
Cali.
of Bogota and
Este
Cali.
seminario será
This
en español
seminar
y en inglés.
will
Tenemos
happen both in
interpretación
Spanish and in
simultánea
English.
disponible en
So we have
portugués, inglés y
simultaneous
español.
interpretation
We will
available
have
in English and
interpretation in
Spanish.
English, Spanish and Portuguese. Tenemos interpretación en inglés,
We
español
will
y
have
portugués.
interpretation
Por
in
favor,
English, Spanish, and Portuguese.
dejen sus preguntas
Please
en la sección de
leave your
Q&A.
questions in the Q&A
Y bueno,
section.
acordarles que la grabación
And well,
siempre la
let me
tendremos
remind you that
disponible
the
en el
recording
canal
will
de
always
YouTube
be
del
available
banco.
in our YouTube channel
La
of the
red de
bank.
ciudades conecta cerca de 300 ciudades
So
de la
this
región,
city network
promoviendo
connects 300 cities
intercambio
in
de
the region,
soluciones urbanas y
promoting
herramientas de
exchange,
gestión,
urban resolutions, and
fortaleciendo el
management
liderazgo
tools, and
local y las
strengthening
capacidades
local
técnicas,
leadership and
así
technical
como alianzas
capabilities,
entre el sector público,
as
privado,
well as
academia y otros
public-private
organismos
partnerships, the academia,
multilaterales.
and
Nuestro
other
trabajo es
multilateral
acompañar a los
sectors.
gobiernos locales en la
Our work
construcción
is
de
to
ciudades
assist
más
local governments in
sostenibles,
construction of more
inclusivas y
sustainable cities,
productivas.
inclusive and productive.
Este es el último
This
seminario
is the
de la serie
last
Ciudades más
seminar
productivas y seguras en
of the
América
more
Latina y el Caribe.
or safer,
Hemos
more productive
tratado el
cities in
11
Latin
de
America and in the
junio sobre la
Caribbean.
reconversión territorial,
Actually, we've been talking
sobre
about
estrategias
territorial
de
reconversion,
planificación y transición
planning
y
strategies,
productiva. Eh,
and
y la
productive
semana pasada, el
strategies.
17 de
And
junio,
last
hablamos
week,
sobre
on the
seguridad
17th
ciudadana,
of
sobre
June, we
estrategias
talk about
locales para prevenir
citizen
la
safety, local
violencia desde el
strategies to
territorio. Y
prevent
lo que nos
violence
convoca
from the
hoy,
territory.
formación laboral
And
en
what we're going to do
ciudades, que
today,
es
which is job
nuestro
training
último
in
seminario de
the
esta serie.
cities, which
El
is our
segundo
last
semestre
seminar of the series.
tendremos la
In the second
serie Ciudades más
semester,
resilientes en
we
América
have the
Latina y el
more
Caribe y
resilient series in Latin
estaremos
America and the
hablando sobre
Caribbean, and
datos
we're going to be talking
para
about
la resiliencia en ciudades, sobre
data
la
for
gestión de riesgos y los
cities
desastres
resilience,
en ciudades y soluciones basadas
and
en la
obviously
naturaleza.
everything
Para
that has to
recibir
do
la
with risk
información sobre los
management
próximos
and
seminarios,
natural
los invitamos a
disasters in cities
suscribirse
and
al newsletter de
nature-based
la red.
solutions in
Ahora
cities.
acá en el
So
chat
please
compartimos el
subscribe
enlace de la
to
suscripción donde deben
our
indicar su
subscription
preferencia
link.
por los temas de
Well, you will
vivienda
let us what you
y
prefer and
desarrollo
everything that
urbano o
has to do with
subtemas
housing
en
and
la red
urban
de
development
ciudades.
and other sub-issues.
Bueno, empecemos
Well,
ahora sí. ¿Por qué
now
hablar
we're
de
going to go ahead and get
formación
started.
laboral en
Why do
ciudades?
we need to talk about
El
job training in the
80% de
cities?
la población de América
80%
Latina y el Caribe vive en
of Latin America
ciudades.
population
Sin
in the Caribbean
embargo,
lives in
un
cities. However,
50%
50%
de
of
los
those people
trabajadores carece de
and of the
competencias
job
básicas.
force lacks
Solo el
basic
16%
skills.
accede a
Only
educación
16%
terciaria
has
y el
access to higher
40% de la fuerza
education,
laboral
and
se
40% of
emplea
the
en sectores
workforce
de baja
is employed
productividad
in
en
low
la región.
productivity sectors in the
En
region.
consecuencia, al menos 40% de
As a
las empresas
result, at
reportan
least
dificultades para
40% of the
encontrar
companies
trabajadores
report
con las
difficulties to
competencias
find
adecuadas. Hoy
um,
exploraremos cómo los gobiernos
workers
locales
with the proper
pueden
skills.
impulsar
So today we're going to
el
be talking
empleo
about local
inclusivo
governments and to
y
local governments,
competitivo,
how they can
especialmente frente a la
how they can
informalidad
promote
y
competitive
el
skill training
protagonismo
and
juvenil.
everything that has to do with
Compartiremos
obviously the
experiencias de
youth.
Bogotá y
We will
Cali,
share experience from
que están
Bogota, Colombia, and Cali,
apostando por cerrar
Colombia,
brechas de
that
habilidades y
have
fortalecer
been
sectores
closing
productivos
skill gaps
emergentes.
and
En el
cities that
seminario
have
de
been
hoy
obviously
contaremos
promoting
o contamos
emerging
con Karen
jobs.
Maguire,
We have
jefa
Karen
de División de
Maguire,
Empleo Local,
director
Capacidades
of
e
the
Innovación
local
Social
job
de la
division,
OECD,
skills
experta
and
internacional
social
quien presentará
and
sobre
social
el
innovation
rol de los gobiernos
of
locales en la formación
OECD.
laboral.
She's
Muy
going to be talking
bienvenida,
about
Karen.
the role of
Y
local
Carolina
government
González,
and the
especialista senior
role
de la
in job
División de
training,
Protección Social y Mercados
and Carolina
Laborales de
Gonzalez,
IDIC,
senior
quien
specialist
moderará la
of the
conversación e
IDB
introducirá los programas de
Work
pago por
Market
resultados
Social
para la
Protection
formación
Division. She's
laboral.
going to be talking
Muy
about
bienvenida
for
también,
job
Carolina.
training. So,
Además,
Carolina,
contaremos con
welcome.
panelistas de ciudades de
Besides,
Colombia que
we're
nos
going to have
contarán sobre
panelists
los
in
programas
several
de
cities in
formación y
Colombia. They're going to be talking
empleabilidad
about
y
training
el
programs and
programa de pago por
employability
resultados.
and the payment
Viviana
by results
Quiroga,
program.
subdirectora de
Viviana
Empleo y
Quiroga,
Formación de la
Deputy
Secretaría de
Director of
Desarrollo Económico
Training
de Bogotá.
of the
Bienvenida, Viviana.
Bogota Economic
Y
Development
Juan Gabriel
Secretariat,
Bustamante
and Juan
Guerrero,
Gabriel
coordinador de
Bustamante,
la
Employability
empleabilidad de la
Coordinator of
Secretaría de
the
Desarrollo
Economic Development
Económico del
Secretariat
Alcaldía
of the
de
Mayor's
Santiago
Office
de Cali.
in Cali,
Muy bienvenido
Colombia.
también, Juan Gabriel.
Welcome. Juan
Gabriel.
finalmente tendremos un panel de
Last but
conversación
not least,
entre los
we'll have a
panelistas,
panel
y
of conversation
responderemos las preguntas del
between
chat.
every single speaker that we
Antes
have
de comenzar,
today,
nos
and they're going to
gustaría
be answer questions from the
devolverles a
chat.
ustedes un
Before we
poco
go ahead and get started,
esta
we would like
conversación
to
y conocer de
show
primera
you
mano.
this
Les
conversation, everything
invitamos
we've talked
a
about, and
escanear
know
el link,
first, and we invite you
código de
to
barras,
scan this QR
para
code
contestar estas preguntas
to
del
answer
newsletter.
the
Arranquemos
following
por qué
questions.
es importante
Let's start on
para la
why is
ciudad,
it
para la ciudad en la que
important
está
for
cada
the
uno en su
city
ciudad,
that each one of you lives
la
in,
formación laboral con las demandas del
job
mercado.
training
Y
with the
aquí
demands of the
vamos a ir
market.
viendo las
So we're going to be
respuestas que
seeing
tienen las personas
the
que hoy están
answers
conectadas en
that
este
are connected
seminario.
today.
Por favor, los invitamos a escanear.
So please, once again, why is it important for the
¿Por
city
qué
to
es
better
importante
connect
para la
workforce
ciudad
training with
conectar mejor
market
la formación
demands?
laboral con las demandas de mercado? A escanear el
So scan
código
the
de
QR
barras.
code.
No tenemos respuestas.
We have no answers so far.
Promover el empleo, impulsar la economía,
Foster employment,
competitividad,
competitiveness,
integración al mercado laboral, me imagino que dice ahí.
integration to the work market.
Los animo a escanear el código de barras para también irnos contando
So
lo que
please
ustedes consideran
scan the
prioritario
QR code so
en sus
you guys can tell
ciudades.
us what do you think is a priority for your cities, please.
Impulsar la economía, paz, felicidad,
Drive market,
improve lifestyle, progreso.
improve lifestyle, progress, peace,
Bueno, vamos
happiness.
entonces a la segunda
So
pregunta.
now
En la
let's
opinión de
move
cada
on
uno, ¿qué
to
debería hacer el
second question.
gobierno desde
What
su
should the
ciudad
government
para
do?
asegurar que la fuerza
What
laboral
should your
tiene las
city government
competencias que
do to
demanda el sector
ensure the workforce
productivo?
has the
Hemos puesto
skills
aquí
demanded by
algunas
the productive
alternativas:
sector?
mapear sectores productivos
So
emergentes,
here we see map
promover
emerging
alianzas con
productive
empresas
sectors,
locales,
promote
usar
partnerships with
datos
local
para diseñar las
businesses,
políticas
use data to
formativas,
guide training
implementar
policies,
programas de formación
fund
que se
programs based
financien
on
de acuerdo a
employment
los resultados del
outcomes,
empleo, escuchar
and
más a los
listen
jóvenes y a los
more to
sectores del
youth
territorio,
and
o
local
mejorar la
stakeholders,
coordinación
or
con el
improve
gobierno nacional.
coordination with the national government.
Mejorar la coordinación con el gobierno nacional parece ser algo muy importante
So I
para nuestros
think that
participantes
working with
hoy.
the national government, it's a really important
Utilizar
issue
más la información y los
to
datos para
use
mejorar,
information and data
orientar mejor las
to
políticas
better
formativas.
improve training policies.
Bueno, pues con esto
Well, with
quiero pasarle la
this,
palabra a Karen
I would like
McGuire,
to give the floor to
quien
Karen
es la
McGuire.
jefa de la División de Empleo
She's the director
Local,
of the local
Capacidades e
jobs
Innovación Social
division,
de la
skills
ODC.
and social innovation of
Y bueno,
OECD.
Karen,
And well,
¿qué
Karen,
debería
the
hacer el
floor is all
gobierno
yours.
de su ciudad
What
para
should
asegurar que la fuerza
city
laboral
governments
tiene
do
las
to ensure that the
competencias que demanda el sector
workforce has the
productivo?
necessary
Creo
skills
que
that
es
the
parte
productive sector
de la
demands? So
conversación y
we
de la
think it's part of the
participación.
conversation that
Adelante.
we
Es
want
muy
to have here.
bienvenida.
So Karen, welcome. The floor is all yours.
Great, thank you so much. And my apologies for intervening in English, but hopefully the interpretation will make it clear to everybody. I'm just going to jump in and share my screen, and hopefully it will be the right one. And if not, colleagues will tell me to swap. Do you see the full screen?
Yes.
Perfect. Okay, excellent. Well, thanks again, Maria, and I'm really excited to join you this morning in the Americas. And also, we're very excited that the IDB City Network will be joining us for a big event in Barranquilla, Colombia. So for the colleagues also from Cali and from Bogota, we have a big local development forum there in a couple of weeks where we hope to also dive into some of these issues as well. So just to clarify, I come from the OECD in Paris, and we have a program that really looks at local employment and economic development. So we're always trying to think about how to promote job creation and how to get people into those jobs. So really both sides of the coin. So what I wanted to do was just run through a couple of areas we have in a guide that we use for cities, but just to say that you can feel free to look up online the kind of work that we have that includes several of your countries in our databases and our thematic work, whether it's on labor market data and intelligence or supporting reforms and learning from the different reforms in places, or if it's a specific review, for example, of a particular local labor market or regional labor market. And just tomorrow, for example, we'll be launching one about Paris. And I think what's very interesting is we'll hear today from Bogota and Cali some actually very sophisticated types of programs that Paris should be learning from you. So looking forward to the rest of the discussions. So the focus of today is not on the global trends, and some might be a little bit different in certain countries, for example, in terms of demographic change. But of course, aging will hit all countries at some point. But just to say that one of the most important things for cities is to have in the back of their mind, what are these different trends, whether it's generative AI and its impact on exposure of jobs, even to people that they thought used to be preserved from automation, like somebody drafting computer code, but also preparing for the green transition. And I know IDB has reports that show this in Latin America, and we have reports that show this elsewhere. But I know also right now, one of the things that many cities and regions in our group are talking about is also changing trade patterns, of course, as there's some little bit of changes within the global landscape in terms of trade. So keeping those things in the back of the mind of a city is very important for just keeping your eye out for the future and what could hit your city so that you can kind of plan a little bit in advance. Now, we just had a report released last week that looks a little bit more at what is actually the role of cities and local governments. And we have a mapping actually across all of our OECD countries, looking at who does what in promoting, for example, skills for adults and helping with that labor market relevance. And, in most countries, it's generally a shared responsibility. So national governments might have a role, in some cases also regional governments very often have a role. And then, of course, local governments do have a certain role, and we'll go into that in more detail. But one of the things that typically happens, given the nature of competencies across levels of government, is that cities are often responsible a bit more for what we would call basic adult skills provision. And that often is linked with their responsibilities for education, which in many cases they play a strong role, but also because cities tend to be responsible for the social outcomes when other things don't work well. So when other systems fail and people are in a precarious position or are struggling in the labor market, that's when cities often end up having to intervene. But of course, there is also an importance of thinking about across the skill spectrum, because cities also want to be attractive for high-skilled talent in key sectors. But generally, this is a role that is done in collaboration with other non-state actors in delivering the kinds of services to address basic adult skills provision. And here we have in the report just a little bit on, the kinds of responsibilities for financing base and delivery and implementation based on the sort of type of organizational structure of a country in terms of its levels of responsibilities. So what I thought most important to go through today is just to look a little bit about some of the actual tools and approaches that are being taken. And we try to group those, here's just one resource, but just to group into 3 buckets of types of activities. So one, looking at how to promote more inclusion and equality through adult learning so that you use this as a vehicle for inclusion. Now, it's also, of course, an important vehicle for competitiveness. Maria also mentioned some challenges in the intro remarks about low productivity and some challenges for businesses to grow because they can't get workers with the right skills. So it's really about inclusion, but also about competitiveness. And so typically the things that cities can do, because they know what their economic structure is, and they can help with targeting information specifically in career guidance. And this is something that's very complicated. You have to reach different populations differently in terms of who they'll listen to with respect to career guidance. But this is one where cities have an opportunity to really adapt to local needs. The other is to adapt also certain content and eligibility criteria. Maybe there's a certain, for example, migrant group that's particularly present that has particular challenges in your city, for example. Or maybe you're looking at how to address particular groups like women with childcare responsibilities. And so adapting the format to the sort of main groups that are struggling the most in the labor market is another area. And then finally, there's a lot about integrating local services, and here is where those that are struggling the most, often it's not just about matching into a job, it's about many other social service needs. So we'll talk about that in a second. The second bucket is really getting a sense of employers and mobilizing them, because ultimately employers do most of the training of the adult workforce. Once you're into the workforce, it's employers that are doing a lot of this work. So there's a big importance about the strategic information and the sort of skills intelligence to understand what is demanded in the market and what are the skills people have, and also the sort of overlap. And there's very sophisticated ways of looking at this now with large language models and looking at job postings. Now, it's a little different in countries where maybe not everything is going through an online job ad system, but these are tools that a lot of places are using in order to get a more fine-grained assessment of the sort of the data on what is demanded now. But of course, if you want to think about what's going to be needed in the future, this is where, of course, dialogue with employers is going to become a lot more important. And then, of course, a lot of cities are doing additional support to help match supply and demand, and they do that in different ways. And then the other big issue and bucket of policy approaches is really the strong local skills ecosystem. So it's making sure that cities are able to benefit from all the different programs and activities coming from higher levels of government, but also that they're very good at connecting locally with whether it's businesses, nonprofits, and others that are active, in terms of education, training institutions, et cetera, in the skills space. So I'll just flag a couple examples on each of these slides since we want to make sure there's plenty of time for everybody in the discussion. But just to flag that there are cities, even if it's not their sort of necessarily their official role, but that often will take take action to help support job matching. And it could be through online platforms, it could be through job fairs, it could be links with neighborhood centers, or it could be directly with the schools at different levels. So that's sort of one bucket on sort of targeting career guidance to local needs. Another, in terms of adapting the eligibility and also some of the social goals. And so, examples like in Paris, where they're trying to train up people, but focusing on areas they think are important for the city, such as the circular economy, for example. Or if they wanted to sort of integrate local services. And so you see different models in different places. The Nordic countries, the municipalities tend to have actually a very strong role, much more than in other parts of the world in terms of sort of employment and social services. And so just to do a quick zoom in on a report that was looking specifically at this local service integration, which is something where cities can really help support because often they have the link on the social side, and it's a way to provide more effective support, but also be more sort of efficient in spending. And some of the elements that help make this successful are sort of bringing together multidisciplinary teams that are addressing employment, but also maybe some of the other challenges that somebody's facing. So a more human-centered design with an individual plan, but also sort of sharing across systems. And of course, there are often challenges because they're not the same departments, they're not the same databases. And so this is often more challenging to achieve, despite the fact that it would actually be the ideal for people. The second bucket, just to give a few examples in terms of getting employers on board, and this is really a strong local role that can be taken in this workforce training space. So some of them it's using sort of councils of private and public actors to sort of discuss local skills supply and demand. And we see that, for example, in the UK and London, it's, public-private body that's advising the mayor on how to best support that matching and giving employer insights. We actually, in the report we'll launch for Paris tomorrow, are suggesting that they do a lot more in this space, for example, because they don't have that systematic engagement with employers. Also different measures in terms of, platforms to help match people directly to jobs. Sometimes this is done by Public Employment Service, and sometimes it's done by some additional activities of a city, or, other ways to engage through, for example, a commitment or pledge, for example, that employers can make in the city. And the city has a great convening power to do that. And in terms of the role of the private sector, there's another recent report we looked at on the chambers of commerce and the important role they can play, of course, with cities in supporting the sort of accurate skills needed for the market. And we see that they play a lot of different roles, these chambers of commerce, whether it's in information and guidance to support cities, whether it's helping with capacity building, and helping also on the firm side, because sometimes the matching is not working because of the way firms are looking for people, not because the people themselves don't have the skills. But also being engaged in different partnerships or being engaged in the recruitment and service matching. So chambers of commerce, and there are some examples from different places and cities around the OECD that are looking into that. And the third bucket is really on this local skills ecosystem, and this is where there's really a great opportunity for action because ultimately a lot of the resources are coming from other levels of government as well. And so mobilizing them and that coordination with higher levels of government becomes, it's always a challenge in every country, but even more important in a space where a city doesn't have the formal competencies. And also just the coordination and a lot of the, sort of no wrong door or, one window type of approaches that cities can do to kind of say, okay, here's what we have in our skills ecosystem and here's how to guide people to the right resources. And just to flag that in a forthcoming report, also with IDB and the World Association of Public Employment Services, there's a deep dive in particular on how to work with the social economy, and this, we're talking about nonprofits, cooperatives, and other structures to help deliver services directly to those that are struggling perhaps in the labor market, to hire job seekers directly, or as a great resource to provide advice on programs and policies that maybe the city is engaging in order to target them effectively to the communities that they work with the most. And another report I just want to flag that I think would be of interest to this group in particular because of the high levels of informality in the labor market and sort of different opportunities that the social economy can make through, for example, cooperatives to support collective entrepreneurship because of the different ways that it can increase their bargaining power. It can lower barriers of entry for them to access financing, education and training, etc., and also maybe access better working conditions. So, and I think we'll hear a lot more in detail on some of the performance-based contracting. So just to flag that, this is done in some local places around the OECD, tends to be a bit more Anglo-Saxon countries, to be quite frank, Canada and the UK, where that these, considerations for performance-based contracting come up. And some of the things that we've seen in systems at different levels, also at national level, is just making sure that there's really a competitive market if we're going to be asking different providers to do that. And also some issues of data privacy concerns, and then the right financial incentives, because somebody might, for example, seek to just get them into work, but then within 2 months, the person no longer is in employment. And so that performance contract was maybe not structured in the right way. So I think we'll have an opportunity to exchange more in the discussion, but just wanted to give a little bit of an overview of the types of workforce development activities that cities can take, even if they're not the main responsibles for these policy areas, and look forward to more discussion in the panel.
Thank you so much, Karen. Great presentation. Bueno, pues ahora quisiera pasarle la palabra a Carolina
I would like
González,
to
especialista
give the
senior
floor to
de la
Carolina
División
González,
Social
Senior Specialist
y de
from the
Mercados Laborales
Social
del BID,
Division
quien
of
nos estará moderando
Labor Market
la
at the
sesión del
IDB.
seminario de hoy.
She's going to be
Adelante,
moderating
Carolina.
today's
Gracias por
seminar.
estar con nosotros.
Carolina, go ahead. Thank you for being with us. Thank you.
¿Aquí me escuchan?
Sí,
Thank you. Can you guys hear me? Yes, we can
Muchas
hear you.
gracias,
We can
María
hear you just fine.
Camila,
Thank
y
you, Maria
muchas gracias a
Camila.
Karen por la
Thank
presentación
you,
tan
Karen, for that
interesante.
really interesting
Pues para mí es un
presentation.
placer estar aquí,
For
como
me,
comentaba María
it's a pleasure
Camila,
to be
yo trabajo en la
here
división
as a
se
moderator.
encarga
I
de mirar
work
los
in
temas de
the
protección social y
office that
mercados
is in
laborales
charge of
del
everything that has to
banco,
do with job markets
y
and social protection in the
nos
in
encanta
the
conversar
bank.
con
And we
el
love
equipo de la red de
to
ciudades,
talk
pues
about to the
sabemos
city
de
network guys,
primera mano que
because we know firsthand that
la
um,
actividad de los gobiernos
the
subnacionales
activities of national
el interés de
governments
los gobiernos
and the
subnacionales por
interest
mejorar el
of the
funcionamiento de
subnational
los
governments
mercados
for
de
improving
trabajo
everything that we
productos de
do in the
inclusión
job
social
markets and
o
the
de
moments of social
competitividad
inclusion or
es
competitiveness
muy presente y muy
is
palpable en toda América
quite
Latina.
high and quite important in Latin
Tenemos
America.
en este
We have
panel un
in this
grupo
panel
muy interesante
really interesting group
de representantes
of
del
representatives
de gobiernos
of
subnacionales colombianos de Cali y de Bogotá que
Colombian
nos van a
subnational
conversar, nos van a
governments, Cali and
comentar un poco
Bogota,
sobre
and they're going to be
los
talking
esfuerzos que
about
han hecho
the
en esas
efforts
dos
they
ciudades
have
por
made in those
mejorar
two
la
cities
manera como se
for
estructuran y se
improving
implementan
the
los
way
programas de formación para el
in
trabajo.
they structure their job market
Todos los
programs.
gobiernos de las
Every
ciudades
single
suelen
city
estar preocupados
government
por
tend
la
to be
inclusión laboral
worried
en América Latina,
for
porque venimos
job
de,
inclusion
en nuestros
in
países
Latin
hay
America, because in
muchísima
our
inclusión,
countries
hay muchísima
there's a
inequidad en el
lot of
mercado laboral, pero
exclusion,
más en
inequality in the
nuestras
job
ciudades y
market
en nuestros países en general,
and the
porque
countries.
retos
And
grandes en materia de
obviously, there are
competitividad y productividad.
huge challenges in terms
En el
on
caso de
competitiveness
Bogotá
and
y Cali,
productivity. In the case
los
of
invitamos a
Bogota
este
and
espacio
Cali,
porque han hecho
and we
innovaciones muy
invited these cities
interesantes
because they have
en la
done
manera como se
really
implementan y se
interesting
fijan sus
innovations, the way
políticas
they
laborales.
implement
Y
their
nuestros
job
invitados
policies.
vienen además de las Secretarías de
And our
Desarrollo
guests
Económico,
come
que son las instancias
from the
internas de los
Economic
temas de
Development
competitividad.
Office.
Y a través
Basically,
de la
they're the guys in
competitividad
charge of
empiezan a pensar
competitiveness,
en los
and through
temas de empleo.
competitiveness, they start to think
Entonces,
about
antes de
employment.
empezar y
So
darle la palabra
before
a nuestros
we give the
invitados,
floor to our
quiero
guests,
robarme unos 5 minutos
I would like to take
para
5
enmarcar un
minutes
poco la
to give you
discusión
guys
y
a general
comentarles
framework of
una
the
presentación
discussion
reciente que tenemos
and
en el
talk
banco
about
que,
the most
que fue muy
recent
informada por las
release
experiencias de Cali y de Bogotá, pero también
of
de
the
otros
bank
lugares
that
del mundo
talked about the
en el
experience of
diseño
Bogota
e
and Cali
implementación de estos
in the
programas de
design and
empleo a
implementation
nivel
of
ciudad.
these implement programs at a city level. And
Y la
um,
innovación sobre todo
and the
tiene que ver
innovation
con la manera en la que estos
has to
programas se
do
han
in the way
estructurado
in which
para
these programs have been
incentivar
structured
resultados en empleo.
to
Les
incentivize
voy a marcar un poco cuál es la
job inclusion.
innovación,
So I'm
por
going to
qué
talk
son
to you
estos
about what
objetivos y
inclusion
cómo lo
actually
estamos
is
tratando de apoyar desde
and
el
how
BID
we
con
have been
la versión
trying to
reciente que espero que
support
sea de
them
utilidad
to
para todos
this,
porque es una
to the most
publicación
recent
que pretende
release,
ser muy
because
accionable, muy
this,
práctica
we
para
want to make this
operadores
publication really
públicas
actionable,
que quieren mejorar
right?
la
For
eficiencia y la
cities
efectividad de
that
los
want to
programas de
improve
empleo
public
que
policies
logran
and effectiveness of these
las personas.
programs that are
Entonces voy a
part of the
comenzar a
city's
presentar.
agendas. So I would like to start presenting about this last
Compartirles
publication,
mi
share
pantalla.
my screen in a couple seconds.
Como les comentaba
as I mentioned
hace un
before,
rato,
just a minute ago,
en general en América Latina y el Caribe, tanto los
in
gobiernos
general, in Latin
nacionales como los
America, in the
gobiernos de las
Caribbean,
ciudades
both
implementan
national
programas
and
de
city
empleo.
governments
En
implement
muchos
employment
casos estos
programs.
programas de
And in many
empleo
cases, these
responden a las
programs
dificultades que tiene
respond
buena
to
parte de
the
la población
difficulties
a acceder a
that
rural
most cities
claridad.
have
¿Cómo que no
by
se escucha
accessing
bien?
the rural clarity. We don't see your screen.
Ah,
They're telling her we don't see our screen. She's apologizing right now.
¿Aquí la están viendo?
Can you see my screen right now? There we go.
Entonces,
There we go.
Hay en muchos países,
So,
en todos los países de América Latina y
in every single
Latinoamérica,
country
hay grandes
in Latin America and the
dificultades
Caribbean, there are
de la
huge
población de
difficulties for
acceder a agua de
most
calidad,
people to
incluso en momentos
access
de
high
expansión
quality jobs.
económica. Y como
Even at moments
mencionaba
of
Karen
economic
hace un rato,
expansion,
muchos gobiernos
and as Karen
nacionales
just
y
mentioned,
subnacionales responden a
many
estos con
national and
programas
subnational
en los que
governments respond to this
capacitan
with programs in which they
a las
train
personas, les dan
people, in
certificaciones,
which they
les
give them
capacitaciones,
certificates
les ayudan a
for
buscar
the
empleo a
acquired
través de servicios de
skills.
empleo,
They
agencias de
provide
empleo
them
temporales.
in job
Todas
seeking
esas
with job
subsidios le
seeking
pagan a
assistance.
los
They give
empresarios
subsidies to the payroll,
parte
and
del
they pay
salario para
business
lograr la
owners
inclusión de las
pay
personas
part of the salary to
desfavorecidas. Hacen programas de
acquire
empleo
that
temporal, son
inclusion
muy
of the
comunes en las
most
ciudades
disadvantaged
de América
people, and that's
Latina.
really common in the cities in Latin
Programas
America.
para cuidado de parques,
Programs,
programas
for
para
example,
infraestructura
for
urbana,
park
en las que
care,
contratan a personas
parks
de
care,
baja calificación,
urban
les ayudan
urban care as
a
well.
acceder a esos
They
empleos.
hire
Se
low-income
parte
people and
como
allow them
para
to
permitirles
access these
ampliar su
jobs,
trayectoria
to
laboral.
allow them to broaden
Estos
their
programas son muy
job
comunes
skills.
y de hecho en la última década han
So
venido creciendo en
these
cantidad en la
are
región.
really common programs, and they have been growing in the
A
region.
veces se hacen, como bien mencionaba Karen, con una
Sometimes,
apuesta de desarrollo
as Karen
productiva.
mentioned, we
Queremos
bet on a
que nuestra
productive
ciudad sea la ciudad
development
más
bet.
competitiva, más innovadora en el sector
We are more
de
innovative. For
digital.
example,
O
I
a
don't know,
veces se
they
hace
want to
con
make the
una
city
apuesta de
more
integración
innovative in the
social,
digital sector,
preocupada por los
or maybe they
jóvenes,
do it in
más
the social side.
vulnerables,
I'm worried about the
los que
youth,
están
the
en
most
riesgo,
vulnerable
los que tienen
people,
riesgos
because
grandes de
they're
caer
at
en
risk, because
criminalidad.
they have
¿Cómo puedo
high
ayudarlos
risk
a
of
eso?
falling into
El
criminal
empleo
life.
termina estando como en esa
So
intersección entre una agenda
jobs
productiva
are at a
de
crossroads
crecimiento
between a
y una
productive
agenda
growth
social.
agenda and a social
Y por
agenda in
esos
the other
dos frentes
axis.
o por ambas, llegamos
And
siempre a las ciudades a
through those
impulsar
two
su trabajo
initiatives, we
público.
get to the cities and
Tenemos
drive
algunos
employment
ejemplos aquí que
programs.
estaré
We have some
compartiendo con
examples
ustedes.
here
Nos
that I
hemos
would like
unido a
to
la red
share
de
with you.
ciudades del vidrio, que
Actually, we
ayuda a
studied
coordinar el
the
desarrollo
IDB cities,
Argentina,
the
que
new
le daba
opportunity of
características
Rosario,
para
Argentina,
jóvenes
that
menores en
provided,
riesgo,
for example,
barrio inclusivo,
workshops
Montevideo, un programa
for
para mujeres
vulnerable young
vulnerables
people
de
that are at high
capacitación y
risk.
empleo
So, Barrio
temporal en
Inclusivo or
áreas
inclusive
urbanas
neighborhood in
como en Estados
Montevideo,
Unidos.
Uruguay, which
O,
was
por
a
ejemplo,
program
algo más
for vulnerable
interesante
women,
también
or
por
something
el
more
contexto, pero de
interesting. I'm sorry about
Digital
the
City
typo,
de
the
Londres,
digital
que es un programa
skill
mucho
boot
más
camps of
sofisticado, digamos, en términos de calificaciones
London,
en las que se busca
which are
impulsar que sean
or
cursos
countries,
intensivos
or
en
London, which
ciberseguridad.
is an intensive course in cybersecurity.
Esos programas son muy evaluados.
So
Sabemos
these
mucho
programs
de
are
ellos.
really
La
assessed.
literatura y
We
la
know a lot
crítica
about
hay
it.
mucha
There's a lot of
consistencia. Hay
literature.
personas que en la
There's a
historia
lot
de
of
estos programas los
people
han estudiado
that
muy bien
have
y podemos saber
that are really
cuándo
familiar with
funcionan
it,
y cuándo
and we
no.
can know
Y
which ones
un
work and
truco
which
muy
ones
importante para que funcionen
don't work.
mejor está asociado a
So
la forma
a
de
really important
contratación.
trick is linked to the way in which
Porque,
they
¿qué quiero decir
onboard
con esto?
people. What do I mean by this?
Una alcaldía, la de
For example,
Bogotá,
I
la
mean
de
yourself is
Rosario, la de
Bogota,
Montevideo, quiere
Rosario,
hacer un programa de
Montevideo.
empleo.
They want to create
Entonces,
a jobs
usualmente lo
program.
que hace
So what usually,
el
or employment program,
gobernante es
usually
contratar
what
a
the
prestadores de
mayor
servicio
does is to hire
que hagan
service
los programas de
providers
capacitación y que dan los
that will
cursos
train
y
the
que dan los
people
servicios de empleo a los buscadores de empleo.
and that will provide them with
Esto,
employment services.
esa subcontratación de sus servicios
And that
a
outsourcing
operadores privados es muy
these
común en
contracts to
toda la
private
región, aquí
operators
como
is quite common in the
en
whole
Estados
region. It
Unidos
actually,
comenzó en los
it's
años
quite common in
60.
the world. Actually, that started in
Y
the
en
US back
América
in the
Latina,
60s.
más o menos
In
en los
Latin
años 90,
America,
cuando crecieron muchos
in the
programas para
90s,
jóvenes
when there
en
were a
ese
lot
momento
of
en la
young or
región
youth
empezaron a
programs that
darse
were
cuenta.
created in the
El
region,
rol
and that
del
started
gobierno
happening
empezó a ser no el
like that.
prestador de
The role of
servicios de
government was not a
contratación,
service provider; they
sino el
were the
administrador de
outsourcer. They
contratos.
were the manager.
Entonces,
They
la
managed the
Secretaría de Desarrollo
contracts
Económico de
through the
Bogotá o de
outsourcing
Cali o
companies. So, for example, the Secretary of Government in
alguna otra
Bogota,
ciudad de la
Cali,
región
Montevideo, Buenos
contrata
Aires,
a prestadores de
they
servicio que hacen
hire
los programas de
service
empleo y que
providers
deben
that
encargarse
actually
además
implement
de
these
ver si esos
jobs
programas de
programs.
empleo
And they're
están
in
bien
charge to say
alineados
if
a lo
those
que
job programs
necesitan
are
las
really
empresas, porque el
aligned to
empleo al
what
final
companies
depende de lo que
actually need.
necesiten las empresas.
Because employment depends on what companies actually need.
¿Cómo, entonces, estas alcaldías cuando contratan a estos
So when
contratistas,
these mayor's offices
cómo pueden
hire these
diseñar esos
contractors,
contratos?
how
Y
they
nos
can
metemos aquí
design
en
these
un tema que es
contracts.
bastante
So
árido,
we're
pero
going to
es bien
delve into
importante.
something that is
Porque
really
ya no
important
estamos
here, but it's
hablando de empleo,
kind
estamos
of
hablando de normas
it's
de
kind of
contratación.
controversial. We're talking about
Yo puedo contratar a esos
contracting
contratistas
models or hiring
pagándoles
models.
por el
I
costo de su
can hire them
capacitación.
by
Entonces
payment, for
el
example, by the
contratista
input,
le
for
digo,
example, the
mire, yo le voy
equipment
a
and
pagar a
staff,
usted,
and I tell the
le
contractor,
voy a
hey,
reembolsar a usted por
I'm
el
going to pay
costo
you.
de
I'm
los
going to
cursos que yo
reimburse you
gasto
for
en
the
jóvenes.
cost of the courses that you
O
taught
te
these
puedo
guys
pagar por
or
producto, te
these
puedo
young
decir,
people. I can pay
te
you
voy
for
a pagar por
products.
cuántos
Like I said, okay, I'm
beneficiarios
gonna pay you
capacitó.
for
Si capacitó
how
a
many
100
beneficiaries did you
jóvenes
train?
en
If you
servicios
trained 100 young men, I don't
digitales,
know,
le
in
voy a
digital
pagar
service, their
esta
services,
pero
I'm
también
gonna pay you this
existe la
much.
opción de pagar
But
parcialmente
we can pay them partially by results. I'm going to pay you, I don't know, for not only for the people that you train, but I will pay you if these people actually get a job, and I'm going to give you a total partial bonus for the people that got a job. Actually, I'm going to pay you if that person stayed at that job for 3 to 4 months. That's not a really innovative idea in the world, but it's quite innovative back then when it was invented. But in America, it was actually quite good. Actually, one of the pioneers of this government was the government of Cali and the government of Bogota. So, what is up with this idea? When we pay by results, there's more flexibility in the services that are provided to job seekers. So, for example, the operators that are paid by results can decide how many programs they will teach, how to coordinate it, how many hours they're going to teach in technical skills, how many hours they're going to teach in social emotional skills, with what sectors to work. There's more opportunity to align themselves to the local reality. They use better data, as we saw in the beginning. That's quite important. And it's a really different way of working, but it requires careful job of design implementation because it's not easy. And hiring by results comes together and goes against many of the more traditional rules that happen here in Latin America and the Caribbean. So I would like to close here because obviously the main players of this story are going to be the governors of Cali and Bogota. This is I just want to do some little advertisement in which we have a manual that is available in our webpage. You can download it for free, and it reports, and it's a report basically on what we learned about Cali, Bogota, Buenos Aires, and other major offices like Rotterdam and London, and this effort for trying to improve the way in which we design employment programs that are so important towards a better effectiveness and towards better results. And I would just like to finish by talking about a small issue. The decision to start creating this type of program is not easy, but many times the momentum and the time in which it'll get the better results has to do with crisis. In the case of the US, was in the crisis of 2019 when they had a really big recession. I don't know if you guys remember, and there was so much unemployment in which transformation happened. So basically, like it says here, to the stress of the Great Recession and the resulting crisis of millions of unemployed workers of all skill levels who depend on the workforce system to give real momentum to outcomes-based funding for workforce development. So I would like to talk about this with Cali and Bogota, because they're the ones that created this from the crisis of the pandemic. Thank you for being here with us, Viviana. Viviana is the Deputy Employment Director of the Economic Development Secretariat in Bogota. Thank you, Viviana, for being here with us, and the floor is all yours. Good morning, Carolina. Good morning to everyone that is participating in this webinar today. Thank you for your kind invitation to present our experience from Bogota. So I think you can see my screen.
Quiero contarles entonces, para iniciar,
so just to get started, I would like to tell you that the Economic Development Secretariat in Bogota is the one in charge of everything that has to do with employment, training, competitiveness, and productivity. In the framework of this strategy, right now, we have talento capital, or capital talent, where we want to strengthen both the supply and demand of employment in the city, and we do it through three important buckets. The first one is job training, obviously. We're not the only ones that do this. in Bogota. We also have the Education Secretariat. We have the Social Integration Secretariat. And of course, we have a new entity that's also doing this. But because since we're linked to business owners, since we're linked to competitiveness, we focus ourselves in job training. A second bucket is obviously to be intimidators or be the middleman between the supply and the demand. We have an office that is in charge to provide those employment services, management, and job placement in the cities, officially from the local government. We do that intermediation between supply and demand to this provider, but also through other programs that we have from our Economic Development Secretariat with other service providers. Last but not least, of course, we foster job placement, effective job placement. So that's our goals and results, everything aiming to acquire formalization, competitiveness in the city. So in that context, since we are in charge of everything that has to do with employability and competitiveness in the city, effectively, because of the pandemic in 2020, we forecasted to start working with Bogotá Trabaja or Bogotá Works for economic reactivation. And within this initiative, the first program for payment by results, or PPR, because of its Spanish acronym. It was in 2020, between 2021 and 2023, where we created a performance-based contract to foster, obviously, job management and effective work placement in the framework of economic reactivation. So we wanted to pay by results of effective job placement, obviously upskilling, but do it in a moment in which there was an economic crisis happening because of what was happening with the pandemic. So we emphasized ourselves in women. It was a priority because obviously it was one of the most struck populations because of the COVID crisis. So this payment by results had three attention packets, basically attention buckets, a basic package in which what they did was to register the people in these employment services, especially because of our agency, public services, and to do the pre-selection process of these people that were looking for jobs, and obviously submitting the resumes to potential employers. That was the basic thing in which we started implementation of the program. However, we had a second package that was a little more comprehensive. So we added training or job training, upskilling, for example, with soft skills and these technical competencies that were needed. So here we have an additional element in which we recognize from the city that we need to obviously help them with their skills. And a third bucket that was specialized, in which we did the basic, we added training for the job, but there was a key element, which was obviously the mitigation of barriers. So we create some incentives to mitigate barriers in general to the population that participated from the services, but in particular to the populations of the people that were the most vulnerable. In our case, it was women for that case. So what did we do in those 2 years? We took care of more than 51,000 people, and out of those, almost 30,000 were placed in jobs. So this is where we see that attention and job placement are not the same thing. We do a huge effort to get them jobs, but effectively, we need to make an additional effort so that the population can be placed. It was a difficult moment in which we were in an economic crisis. To achieve this job placement was important, but of course, the goal was to increase that level of job placement from the people that were being taken care of. Back then, obviously, we helped a lot of women.
So if we look here at these 3 packages over 9 months, we saw the implementation. We did this via operators, not only through our agency, but also other operators that had the bandwidth to implement these comprehensive services. The cost here was 45 billion pesos, which is around 11 million US dollars. And we had 3 open public calls for applications to select 8 program operators. This was a huge challenge in terms of operations, as well as hiring and contracting, as well as the day-to-day implementation. And one of the main issues here was that we had not previously worked with payment for results schemas. As we just heard from Carolina, people are accustomed to being paid based on inputs or products. But here, these program operators, as well as us, had to learn about payment for results, that is to say, the effective service provision. So what was the incentive here? There was 100% payment for all these service activities and an additional incentive for the placement of programs. What did we learn from this experience in the prior local administration? We saw that there is a need to have more pronounced risk transfer to the operators and also more attractive incentives for program placement. So all of us in the city employability system were accustomed to payment for products, and we had to transition to a payment for results model. And accordingly, we had to strengthen the incentives for these local operators, even if this required us to reduce the service scale at some point. This is a very important lesson learned. Secondly, without a doubt, we had to strengthen the payment for results ecosystem. We all, as I said, had to learn how this would work. And here the focus is on results rather than activities. We also had to find specialized operators or help to specialize operators in providing services to specific demographic groups. I mentioned already women. So here it is very important these operators be able to recognize the corresponding barriers and come up with differential and personalized strategies to be able to provide services to women, to young people, or to people with disabilities, for example. We also realized that the operation time is crucial. 9 months did work in this case, but that will not always be sufficient, taking into account the ultimate goal that we have and the placement results that we are after. We have to also understand how long it will take to train the target population as well as the response time from companies. So perhaps this time would need to be extended. And finally, we have the issue of verification. In local governments, and I'm sure this is the case across Latin America, we have to have supporting documentation to show that placement was effective, to also show the effectiveness of the operations and also here the implementation. So now let's look on how this impacted on the local government in 2024. Now, our payment for results via the Bogotá Camina Segura program led to the creation of the district payment for results mechanism. And this is all regulated under Decree 442 of 2024. So we have all the necessary regulatory framework to continue to work in this way. So now we have more investment sectors involved in payment for results. So we're doing this in Bogotá, not only for employability, but also for company productivity, also for early childhood services or services for other demographic groups. In Bogotá, we are really betting on payment for results. We are also looking at how to institutionalize the payment for results model in the city. So we now have a committee that revises these projects and improves them. And this comes together with a criteria for project execution and our financial mechanisms. That is to say, we can make plans for more than 1 year, for example, for a 2-year period, looking at how we can contract and then pay for these services, which again is very important because this is a challenge that we have faced in local governments looking at the fiscal regulatory restrictions in place. There's also the definition of the involved actors or stakeholders. So the ecosystem has been created for any kind of payment for results operation, understanding who is the payer, who is the contractor, and so on and so forth. We've also seen the importance of interinstitutional coordination. We are working with the finance department, with different secretariats, for example, Secretariat of Education. We have the health sector involved. So here, this leads to and requires significant interinstitutional coordination. With all of this in mind, we have been working with the IDB, and here we are looking also working with young people as well as women, as well as people over the age of 50 and migrants. So we have of course, other demographic groups that are in conditions of vulnerability, but we are starting initially with these groups. And so 75% of payment is provided for service throughout the service route, and then 25% is the incentive for placements, which is a higher incentive than we had in the previous model. This is how we're doing it in 2025. Now for 2025, the goal is to provide around 3,000 services and end up with 1,300 job placements. And what we are doing is doing everything at a smaller scale to try and improve here the quality of the service and also transfer some of the risk to our operators. We have also increased the implementation time from 9 months to 12 months so that we have a better chance of achieving the results we have set. So what are the steps? Of course, we have the open call for applications and then validation of eligibility. The second step is providing services to the beneficiary population and providing them the skills and competencies training that they need. Looking at what companies need, that is key. So strengthening skills and competencies is key so that companies will open their door to have these people placed in jobs. Third, we have job placement. And here, the operator again has a significant incentive. And here, this is a challenge. How do we verify the quality of the services as well as the real job placement? Are we talking really about people who are formally placed in new jobs and based on what companies truly need to improve the employability of the general population, the competitiveness of our companies? And finally, we have payment for service and placement. This is a continuous cycle throughout the whole project. And of course, we are here very much focusing on business management and vacancy searches. And so here we have expanded our target population and we are trying to make sure this is viable so that companies can truly receive these trained individuals. So we are going to start to implement this new plan. This is basically an improved version of payment for results. You could say it's version 2.0. Thank you very much.
Muchísimas gracias, Viviana.
Thank you very much, Viviana.
Muchísimas gracias, Viviana.
Thank you very much, Viviana. That was fascinating. And
muy ejemplar.
I think this is a really exemplary case in which we can see how you were able to learn from innovation, incorporate the lessons learned, and then integrate those lessons learned to have a solid, a more robust program in the future, and also look at how to improve the institutional structure. I would now like to hand over to Juan Gabriel, who is the employability director for the area in Cali, and we will be hearing here about some very interesting employability programs in Cali. Thank you very much. It's a pleasure to be invited. So here, it's fascinating to hear about what has been occurring, not only in Bogota, but now I will also tell you about what's happening in Cali. We have a similar program, but with different actions. What we are trying to do is create employment opportunities and also look at employment inclusion initiatives, and payment for results definitely helps us there. It's also been a pleasure to hear about everything that's being done in France. We are working with international cooperants in France, looking at the use of new technologies in order to strengthen people's labor skills as well as following up. And we are also working with immutable digital qualifications, which are starting to be used in Colombia, but which have already a longer track record in France and where positive fruits have been born of that effort. Please tell me when you can see my screen.
Sí, la vemos, Juan.
Yes, we can see your screen, Juan.
Listo. Entonces, estamos hablando del tema de cómo hemos tenido una experiencia y una
So
evolución
we
a
are going to
partir
talk about
del
our
pago por
experience and how our
resultados
situation has
de,
evolved
de
based
Cali.
on payment for results
Sin
in
duda,
the city of
entonces,
Cali.
esto nos permite a nosotros tener una innovación y nos
So
permite
here
generar inclusión en
we have
sectores
looked
que
at
nosotros
innovation and
priorizamos
inclusion in
dentro
our
de los
prioritized
diferentes
sectors
grupos poblacionales.
amongst our different demographic
Eh,
groups.
Dentro de los grupos poblacionales que
When it comes to the
nosotros
demographic groups
intentamos
that we
generar mayores competencias y
have
promover
been
su
focusing on
vinculación laboral,
to
pues encontramos sin
strengthen
duda los
their
jóvenes,
competencies
las
to move
mujeres,
forward with
pero también a
greater
las
employment
personas
inclusion,
que
well, we have focused mainly on women,
adicionalmente nos generan a nosotros podemos tener una certificación de que pertenecen a esos grupos poblacionales y
and we
ahí es
have
donde
also
entramos
focused on
nosotros también
groups where it is
a
possible to
utilizar toda
certify
la,
that people
toda
actually
la
belong to these more
tecnología de
vulnerable
las
groups. And
credenciales
here
digitales y toda la
we
tecnología nos
have
ofrece para esto
used
mismo. Entonces,
digital
estamos
credentials to do
trabajando
so.
en esas nuevas alternativas
So
para
we've
grupos
been looking at these
poblacionales
new
como son
alternatives.
las víctimas del conflicto
For
armado, que ustedes
example,
saben que
victims of the
en
armed
Colombia tuvimos un
conflict.
conflicto
In
armado
Colombia, I'm sure you're
muy
aware
prolongado
that
que
we
generó
have
unas víctimas y
had
estas
a very
víctimas cuando hicimos la
prolonged
medición de la
armed
tasa de desempleo
conflict,
de ellas
and
estaba por debajo
they, of course,
del resto de
suffer
la
still
población, o cuando
the
hablamos, por
vestiges of
ejemplo,
that
de las
conflict,
personas
and
con
we see that there
discapacidad,
is
o cuando
also a direct
hablamos, por
impact
ejemplo,
on their
de
employment
las tasas
inclusion.
de
We have also
desempleo
worked
de personas
with
en
people with
proceso de
disabilities
reincorporación porque
as well as
pertenecen a
individuals
grupos
in
armados
a
y ya
process of
están
reincorporation,
insertándose de
having
nuevo a la
been
sociedad. Son grupos que
involved in the
cuando
armed
medimos su
conflict.
tasa de desempleo,
So when we look at
está
these
por encima
groups'
de
unemployment
la que
rates,
está en
we
el resto
see
del mercado de Cali.
that their
Entonces,
unemployment rates are
es ahí
higher than
donde
those of
nosotros hemos
other
tenido
demographic
algunos
groups
retos
in the labor
importantes.
market in Cali.
Y
So that's an important
a
challenge that we
diferencia
started
de
out
lo que
with.
pasa con la Secretaría de Desarrollo Económico de Bogotá, nosotros
So in
en Cali
contrast
hemos
to the case
optado
of the
por ser
Economic
los
Development Secretariat in Bogota, in Cali,
líderes y quienes
we
articulamos a
have
todos los actores que
some leaders of
participan del
these
ecosistema
groups
laboral en
that
la ciudad.
provide
Bogotá,
coordination
como muchas
for
otras
the
ciudades
employment
del Caribe, de
ecosystem
Colombia, perdón,
in Cali.
tiene dentro de su estructura una agencia de empleo y con esa agencia de empleo promueven la
So there is
inclusión
an
laboral de
employment
esos sectores
agency
que
that
priorizan.
promotes
Nosotros, por
employment
el contrario, en
inclusion in
Cali
the case of
decidimos
Bogota. But in contrast,
articularnos
in
con las
Cali,
agencias de
we
empleo que
decided to
pertenezcan al
coordinate with
Servicio Público de
employment
Empleo, que es un
agencies
servicio
that are part of the
nacional,
Public Employment
y estas
Service, which
agencias
is
de
a
empleo
national
entonces a
service.
su vez
And these employment agencies or
pueden
services
tener las funciones de gestión para la
are
vinculación
able
laboral de las
to
personas.
conduct the
Entonces,
necessary
esto sí
management
marca
activities
una
for
diferencia entre las
employment
funciones y cómo
contracting.
proceden cada una
So
de las
this is
dos
an
secretarías,
important
ambas queriendo
difference
llegar al mismo punto de
compared to the
ampliación
case of
de
Bogota.
competencias y
Obviously,
la
we
generación de
all
vinculación
have the
laboral de
same
las
end
personas,
goal, which is
pero
to
como les digo,
strengthen
con estos dos
competencies and labor
enfoques
inclusion,
diferentes.
but
Entonces,
using different
acá en
mechanisms.
la Secretaría actuamos
So
como
here in the
líder del
Secretariat,
ecosistema.
we
Y
are
dentro de la
the
Secretaría de
leading body
Desarrollo
of the
Económico, entonces
ecosystem.
también fomentamos la
And
empleabilidad por un lado y el emprendimiento,
we focus
entendiendo que
on
estos son
employability
las
as
dos
well
vías
as
formales para la
entrepreneurial
generación de
activities,
ingresos
recognizing these as the
en
two formal
cualquier
options for
economía.
income generation in any
Y
economic
nos enfocamos en las
context.
poblaciones vulnerables,
We
que es lo que
focus on
mencionaba al
vulnerable
principio, y aquí es
populations.
donde
As
nos
I
estamos
mentioned at the
apoyando en las
beginning,
credenciales digitales
we have
para
support
identificar la
here
pertenencia de las personas a esos grupos poblacionales. Por ejemplo, mañana
from
vamos a tener
or
una
with the
feria de
use
empleo, que es
of
una de las funciones que
digital
nosotros realizamos
credentials.
también. Esta la hacemos
So
de la mano
we
de un prestador autorizado del Servicio Público
work
de
with
Empleo, de
an
una agencia,
authorized
y
public
por medio de
employment
cada una de
services
las
provider. We
credenciales
will be
digitales, las
working with them in an
personas
employment
se
fair.
presentan
And
con
here we
su
use our
billetera
digital
digital
credentials
y
so
nos
people can
comparten a
attend
nosotros
the
la
job fair
información
with their digital wallet.
verificada de
They can share
su
their
cédula,
verified
de su documento de
information.
identidad, de
They share their
los
cedula or
grupos
national
poblacionales a
identification
los que
document
pertenece y de las
and
formaciones y
details
las
of the
certificaciones
demographic
laborales
group
que
that they
tienen.
belong to, as
Eso
well
nos
as
permite a nosotros
their
decirle a las
employment
empresas que
certificates.
participan de
And
las ferias que la
accordingly, we are
información que
able
se les
to
está
say
entregando es
to
información
those
verificada
companies that
y
are
confiable.
participating
Y
in the
adicionalmente
employment
nos queda a
fairs that
nosotros
these
también como
applicants have been
Secretaría de Desarrollo
verified.
Económico una data
And
de cuántas
we also
personas y
have
qué
data
sectores
on
están
how
buscando
many
empleo
people
para
and from
poder
which
empezar a
sectors are seeking
gestionar ese empleo
employment
con
so
las
that we
empresas
can
y
start to
tener
look for employment
en las
opportunities
siguientes ferias de
with
empleo
the
sectorizadas
relevant
por sectores de la
companies.
economía
And we
o
can
por
here
temas
work
de
on
competencias
focal
de las
sectors
personas que
or based
permitan que estas
on
ferias
these
sean cada vez
applicants'
más
competencies.
eficientes. Y nos vamos a
And so
apoyar
the idea is
en
to
el
become
nuevo
increasingly
modelo que va a
efficient.
utilizar el Servicio Público de Empleo, que cambia
And we
de
are going
ICITE
to
a un modelo que se llama Sí Emplea,
going to be working with the new National Employment Services model, which is called Si Emplea. It's a better developed version of the previous model. For those of you joining us from other countries, I hope this leaves it clear for you what our scope is and how we work. So now I'd like to tell you about our experience with payment for results, working hand in hand with the IDB. So we saw that there were enormous employment growth opportunities and there were many achievements. At the same time, we identified some frustrations. Carolina supported us here, as did Christine. She was a fantastic leader who provided support from the bank. And we worked on this initiative in 2019 and 2020. And so, and here we also have employment insertion. And so here we work with companies. What we do is we go to them and we ask them what competencies they need. And we speak with applicants to see what their existing competencies are. And so then what we are able to determine is whether or not the applicants need further training or if they require formal certification of these skills, because oftentimes companies ask for formal certifications that these individuals do not have. We also provide technical training. This is all personalized based on companies' needs. We have shorter training options. We have had some training programs here in Cali. I know the same thing has been done in Bogota, for example, to train drivers of mass transport systems. We have also provided training in clothes manufacturing and sewing. Basically, what we do is we look at what the labor market needs. This year, we will have a large program, and we will be providing significant resources from the Financial Development Secretariat. And we also have support, or we are able to base our decisions somewhat on the figures and reports provided to us by the IDB. We also have employment or job fairs where companies advertise their vacancies. And here, applicants are able to scan the QR code of the company they're interested in applying to, the vacancy that they want to apply to, and that automatically connects them with this company and cross-checks their credentials. We also have productive inclusion and dual training. We took this from the Swiss model. Basically, while someone is studying, they in tandem participate in an internship program. And the idea is that they have more permanent support during that internship or job experience program to make that more effective. So basically, the idea is to make all of this much more efficient. So I'd also like to talk about our first social impact bond that we worked on in 2019 and 2020. We worked with BidLab and CIPSCO for this project. But in 2019, what was of course prior to the pandemic, we had already seen that there were some social protests here in Colombia, more specifically in more specifically in Cali. And we saw that there were many complaints around the more generalized social situation in Colombia, and particularly with regards to job inclusion. And so employability here is not only an issue of development, but also a social issue. And so in these protests, we saw that people were in many cases protesting against a lack of inclusion. And this was having an impact on hiring processes. And people were unable to improve their skills, and companies in that situation, in that context, were not sure if they should invest in growth. And then 2020 arrived, of course, the pandemic. And that presented a huge challenge for us because we had a very ambitious project. It was the most ambitious project we had to that date. And despite everything that happened during the pandemic, that of course I didn't need to explain everyone, we nonetheless managed to place 856 people in formal employment in 2020. And that was thanks to the use of different funding or financing mechanisms. I don't think that had we used other models, would we have achieved those 856 formal job placements. 599 of those placed in jobs still had those jobs 6 months later, which shows the effectiveness of the program. These people all enjoy dignified working in conditions. They all receive the payment of their parafiscal benefits. And so we were able to here validate the way in which we measured results, as well as how we would follow up on these job placements. So this really changed our history in the Secretariat of Economic Development. And since that time, what we are really focusing on is ensuring that information is verified and hopefully in real time, so that these results last a lot longer. So here it's payment for results rather than payment for activities. So here we ensure effective placement of resources. Of course, if we are paying for activities, you have to really monitor exactly how everything is being done. But when it's payment for results, you can, at the end of the process, look more at whether or not the person was effectively placed, and if new developments have been achieved. So for us, this is a huge difference, because in the case of paying for activities, you're paying for them regardless of whether or not they were well executed. But here in payment for results, we are guaranteeing that the whole cycle has been fully completed, because in this case, people have received their training. Companies here have also access to people with the skills they require. And so this is, you could say, a very successful model. And if for some reason it's not successful, that's also an important point to be taken into account for future processes. So here, in payment for results, we don't have to pay for any results that were not achieved. So here are the lessons learned. So here we also provide psychosocial support during the training processes. We also have to ensure that we have appropriate selection of participants and also look at their motivation so that they will stay on in these jobs, showing them that this is in fact the pathway forward to receive better salaries and have better working conditions. And it's also important to be flexible, so that here employers, or rather where we can guarantee results with the technology that we have access to, it's much easier for us to be able to monitor. If you go back to 2019, we didn't have access, for example, to highly developed AI tools or blockchain such as we do now. And so we've seen many developments in recent years, and we have to take full advantage of these tools in our employment efforts. And the IDB is clearly a leader in this area. And so we were able to achieve efficient social investment. And here we see that governments as well as corporates are making significant investments here. and we can ensure that these resources will be appropriately used. So now moving over to the new model of payment for results, we will still count with support from the IDB, as well as resources from Canadian funders or cooperants, and we will also have execution being led by the Canadian cooperants, focusing on the demographic groups that require here greater help here in Colombia. Once again, working with women, young people, and migrants. We're not exclusively working with these groups, but they will be prioritized. We will be focusing on skill creation and placement in those specific cases. And here we have selected the manufacturing sector. Specifically, we are talking about clothes manufacturing or the fashion sector. The idea is to have people stay on in their jobs for at least 3 months. Of course, the idea is that they stay on for longer, but here what we are going to try to do is to include more people in the program, have more beneficiaries. And we've had meetings with employers in the clothing manufacture sector so that they can participate from the very beginning in the selection of these beneficiaries. And the idea is there, of course, to provide the appropriate training for these individuals. And the idea is through this model to also close gaps. For example, by providing them with also some funding to cover their transport costs during the first month of the new jobs. Or for example, they need an outfit to go to work. We can also provide that. We can do this with the current model because we are able to identify the entry barriers for these individuals so that we can continue to be successful down the track. So here, what we are doing is looking at employability and how long people stay on in their jobs. Here we are providing benefits for those who are seeking jobs, and this is also of great benefit to companies that are seeking economic growth. We recognize dignified employment as here an engine for development, and the idea is to create greater wealth and accordingly create more job opportunities specifically for dignified labor. I hope that I did not talk for too long, but that is the experience that I wanted to share with you today.
Muchísimas gracias, Juan. Ay,
Thank you
perdona.
very much,
Se me
Juan.
logró. Muchísimas gracias, Juan,
Thank you very much, Juan,
por tu exposición y de verdad que fue
for
muy
your
interesante ver
presentation.
cómo
It was
ustedes
very interesting
sortearon estos
to
desafíos
hear,
tan grandes durante la pandemia y además
particularly about how you
pues,
overcame challenges during the pandemic
dramático en la ciudad.
and how you
Mira,
dealt
pues
with
ahora
the
procedemos al
dramatic
panel.
situation
Entonces
in the
vamos a hacer
city.
una
We will
sesión
now
de
move forward with our
preguntas y
panel.
respuestas
So
por unos
let's
15
now move
minutos. Vi que había
to
algunas
questions and answers, or rather a Q&A
preguntas de
session. I see
eh,
that there
los
are
miembros, las voy a tratar de incorporar y
some
combinar y alcanzaremos
questions
a hacer
from the
unas
audience. I will
preguntas a
try
cada
to
uno de los
incorporate
participantes.
them into
Vamos a
this
tratar de hacer lo
discussion.
más ágil posible.
I'll try to
Para
be as
Karen,
quick as
mira,
possible. So here's a question for
quiero
Karen.
preguntarte, hay una pregunta que salió en el chat y que
There's a
está
question here in the chat.
también en el caso de la relación que tiene el gobierno nacional con
When it
el
comes to the
gobierno
national
internacional.
government's relationship with subnational governments,
Que tú lo mencionaste, pero también
you
aquí a
mentioned
Centimeter
that
salía
relationship,
como uno de los más elegidos, ¿no?
but
¿Cómo
this
se han
showed up on the
compartido
Mentimeter as one of the most important topics. So how do you manage the relationship between the national government and the subnational government when it comes to employability? And what are some best practices that you could mention to us there?
Great, thanks, Carolina. I mean, I think this, what we call here, multi-level governance or intergovernmental relations is always very complex. And one of the sort of facts we have to deal with in any country is that often national governments are the ones that have the networks and the budgets. And so being able to identify how to partner effectively with them. And one of the ways is to complement, for example. So just to give you the example here in Paris, since we're launching the report tomorrow, you have the National Public Employment Service that's operating in the territory of the city of Paris. And they provide certain types of services and certain trainings. But what the locality needs to figure out is, okay, what can I do to complement and how can I inform national policies so that they're attentive to the needs? And so oftentimes you will have committees, for example, associated with some of these national bodies where localities might be able to provide feedback or give some suggestions if something isn't working well for them in their districts. And the other kinds of things that happen in some countries is also some form of either asymmetric decentralization. Maybe some competencies are granted to a larger city saying, okay, well, we'll maybe ask you to do a little bit more. Now, this can be very political depending on what country context you're in and the nature of your country's constitution. Just to give you an example, in Sweden, they went to a very contracted out, they were transitioning to a much more contracted out model. And the municipalities had the practice of also doing support for employment inclusion, and they wanted to be able to compete. But it wasn't within the sort of legal rules to allow a municipality to be designated through procurement, in this case, as a service provider. So there are, you know, a lot of this is going to depend on the arrangements, but no matter what in any country, you have to work together to get the most out of what happens in your territory. And I just want to flag it. I don't think it's in the questions here, but I just wanted to raise a couple of other points, which is one, that when we think about the effectiveness of your local labor market, one of the issues is that the city or, you know, municipality, even if it's a big city, often the actual labor market based on commuting flows is much bigger than the actual municipal boundaries. And we see that in a lot of cities. And so there's another issue, not just coordinating up with national government, but also being effective at coordinating with your neighbors. And we see this in, just to give you a couple examples, Brussels, the commuting zone is like 27 times the size of the actual city of Brussels, for example. And so they have to think and work much more effectively together because maybe some of the people that they have in the city center actually are very effective at jobs or have the skills for jobs that are outside of the city center or vice versa. And so you have what we call these functional urban areas and the ability to be fluid and also get people to jobs, because as housing prices are a major problem in all cities around the world for the most part, people with challenges in the labor market often have to move further and further out. And then you have transport issues that then become an additional barrier to inclusion in the labor market. So I did just want to flag that element because it hadn't come up really in the discussion yet, but it's one of the most important things that cities can do as they're thinking about a functioning labor market that's both competitive and inclusive.
No, tienes toda la razón. Creo que eso resuena mucho con mis.
That is spot on, Karen. And I think that would really resonate with, in particular, those of us who are in Bogota. And the public transport system has in fact become central to labor inclusion. Sometimes labor issues can be resolved with non-labor policies, for example, with an effective transport policy. Bibiana, I now have a question for you from the audience, which is in the Payment for Results program in Bogota, how did you calculate the payment to be made to the operators? We have thought a great deal about this, Carolina. And we thought about that for version 1.0 as well as version 2.0. So the first thing to be said here is that you have to ask the market, ask the operators who are authorized employment service providers, and it's very important that training is offered in the relevant skills and competencies. So basically, we ask the market, how much would it cost to provide the service to an individual from end to end? So the operators might say, this will cost $500 from the moment that the person enters the program all the way up to employment placement. So those $500 in version 1.0, 90% of this money was paid for the service and the additional 10% was paid for employment placement. So let's say $450 were paid for every person included in the program, and that additional percentage was given for employment placement. But what we have thought will work better for the second version is to have a higher incentive so that a greater effort is made in actually achieving real employment placement. So now it is divided 75-25. So those $500 for each individual in the service, we will pay $375 if the full service is provided all the way from registration up to intermediation, and that additional bonus, that is to say those $125 will be paid if that person is effectively placed. And this payment is tied to us being able to verify that the person received the full service, that this individual also receive training in soft skills and technical skills that are required for the jobs on offer. And then also we need to have proof that the person was contracted, hired by a company with all of the full legal requirements. That's what we have in mind. Let's see how we go in version 2.0, in which we have a higher incentive or bonus for job placement. Thank you very much, Bibiana. We have another question here for Juan. It's very much related, which is related to the Payment for Results program. The question is from a participant from Argentina who asks if a similar Payment for Results program could be implemented in Argentina. If I can just here give my opinion, I think a similar program was conducted in Buenos Aires in Argentina. But basically, the question for you would be, Juan, what is needed for this kind of program? I'd also like to frame this question based on something that Karen said. If you want to improve employability and formal employment, you have to focus on many characteristics. Here, we are focusing on an important detail, which is how hiring is conducted through operators. That is important, but we also need many other additional instruments, necessary structures, companies, and so on and so forth, relationships with the government. This is all very important. It's basically to say that this is a very broad agenda to ensure inclusive employment practices. So Juan, what do you think is needed in order to be able to implement a similar program elsewhere? What are the basic ingredients in the recipe, so to speak? I think there are many ingredients, but when it comes to innovation, there will always be new challenges. When it comes to the team that is providing support for contracting in the corresponding entities or companies, if they are not accustomed to working with payment for results, it will take them some time to understand how these contracts work. So the first recommendation is to look for support from other experiences, people who are further ahead in the process. Carolina is an expert in this, and she knows the challenges that have been faced in other areas. I would also be very happy to help, and I'm sure that Viviana would also be very happy to share her experiences. The second point, for example, the question that Viviana just responded to, how much to pay for training versus employment placement? Well, you have to do a lot of research to identify how much should be earmarked for each of those stages to appropriately motivate the companies and the operators to ensure that the training is effective, but also to ensure that there is true job placement at the end. So that's when it comes to pre-work or prior work to be done. And then later in the process, when it comes to determining which demographic groups in Argentina that require greater support, well, we would be very happy to help with that. I think that if you are able to resolve those points, you would surely be able to be successful. Thank you very much, Juan. And now we would like to ask a question related to the main message. So basically, what would you prioritize? I really liked the first question. You know, what is the most important and what should be prioritized? So not only coming to payment for results. Here we're trying to ensure that training and skills and employment services, as well as employment services provided from the city, actually lead to inclusive employment. But what has to be most prioritized if we look at all of the work that's being done in Cali, Bogota, and by the OECD in the case of Karen? You go first, Karen. What is the most important priority here?
Well, I mean, I think the most important priority is really to understand the challenges in your local labor market so that you can use your convening power to try and address them. You can explain what the needs are to other levels of government if they're the ones that have the resources. You can explain it to the business community and work effectively with them. You can work effectively, hopefully, with your education and training providers. And I think that it's this convening power, even if you don't have a huge amount of fiscal autonomy, that is perhaps the most important. And the other challenge is also identifying where there are problems elsewhere so that your job is a little bit easier. Are you fixing the fact that the basic education system isn't doing what it's supposed to be doing? Are we not teaching the relevant digital skills as well? Or are the employers not doing what they need to be doing in order to have their workers with the right skills? And so I think this is one of the things that that one can prioritize. Now, we actually just had at our staff meeting, what would be the billion, if you had $1 billion, what would you want to do? And my fantasy is that and AI tools in the future might be able to help us do that, is to say, okay, here's my problem. What is the most efficient use of resources to fix that problem? And what it means is really understanding the nature of the problem and trying to address it. And I think, you know, some of the programs that we were just heard described are great, and other OECD cities should learn from the experiences of Bogota and Cali. But understanding, you know, if it's a particular population group that's struggling, what are the things that can be done up front to help them? And I also wanted to point out, I think this very interesting, that the psychosocial services that were raised also in the interventions, because that's what we're finding quite a lot as well with those that are struggling the most, because those that are doing okay can sort of, they can figure out their own way. but those that struggling the most are very costly to a city, and they're costly not just because of the placement into a job, but the implications for their family, for their children, and what happens to their children if they don't have the resources to have a stable lifestyle. So I think, fixing those, identifying where these different problems are that are feeding into the challenge you have with the labor market is going to be extremely valuable, because let's face it, we are not equipped for the massive amounts of skill changes that are going to be needed in all economies. We don't realize how quickly we're going to have to change our skill sets, and the systems aren't ready to manage that. So the other thing cities can really do is help to build up those relationships in that skills ecosystem so they can be a bit more responsive. And that's not a money issue, it's a relationship issue.
Absolutely. So yeah, thank you so much, Karen. Juan, what is your $1 billion answer? What would you prioritize in Cali?
Mira, yo priorizaría, pues
Well,
tal
I
vez no
would,
solo en Cali, sino siempre en cualquier iniciativa de estas, el poder
in any
tener
of these initiatives,
resultados medibles
I
y verificables,
would prioritize the importance of having
aprovechando las
measurable
nuevas
and
tecnologías. Yo soy
verifiable
un
results.
abanderado
And
de esta nueva ola de tecnología, lo veo
I
como
really am a
oportunidades,
champion
si bien
for this
algunos
new wave of
empleos
technology. I
van a
think there are great
cambiar su forma de
opportunities here.
realizarse, algunos
While
se van a
some
destruir,
jobs
van
will
a haber muchos otros
surely
que
change
se
and
van a
others will
crear
disappear, there
y
will others
tenemos
will
que
be
aprovechar la
created. And
tecnología
so we have to
para
take
poder
advantage of
medir
these
exactamente qué es
technologies
lo que tenemos, con qué personas
and be able
contamos,
to measure
qué
what we are
competencias están
working with, how
adquiriendo
many people are
estas
working with,
personas
what are
para
the
poder
skills these
nosotros
people are acquiring,
apoyar en la gestión de
so that
vinculación
we can
de
provide
ellos. Entonces,
support
si me preguntas
in their
cuál sería como
placement.
eso que yo diría que va a marcar la diferencia en los proyectos, el
So
poder tener herramientas de
I
medición y
think that
acompañamiento
having
seguros
appropriate
en línea.
tools and
Creo que eso
measurable
está bastante
metrics
relacionado con el punto de Karen de
are very
poder entender
important.
el
So I think
problema
this really
a la
connects with
implementación.
Karen's point about understanding
Totalmente.
the breadth
Viviana,
of the
adelante.
problems. Absolutely. Okay, now Bibiana.
Gracias. Pues concuerdo
Thank
con
you,
Karen y con
Carolina. I
Juan
completely
lo
agree
que
with
han
what Juan
planteado.
and Karen have said.
Dada la experiencia de
I
Bogotá,
think
donde
that
ya
when
hemos
we look
tenido
at
pues
our
algunos
experience
avances
in
importantes en
Bogota,
ambas materias. Todavía nos falta, por
we
supuesto, pero
still have a
dado
long way to
el
go.
camino
But
que ya
based on
hemos
our
recorrido,
experience and what we
yo
have
diría
learned
que
to date,
nosotros
I
debemos
would say
apostarle a
that
la
we really
calidad, a la
have to
calidad
focus
de
on
las
quality,
intervenciones,
the
a la calidad
quality
de
of
esos
these interventions
operadores
and
que
efforts, the
nos están
quality of your
recibiendo a la
operators,
población
because
desde
these
el registro hasta
operators
la
are
colocación.
attending these
La calidad en el
population groups
registro
all
es
the way from the
clave, la
registration
calidad
up
en la
to the end.
orientación es clave, la
Quality in
calidad en la
registration is
formación de las
key.
habilidades y de las
Quality in
competencias
training
es
for
algo
skills and
muy
competencies
importante para
is
que
incredibly
efectivamente la
important.
población se vea transformada y las
And
empresas
so
reciban lo que se necesita.
the idea here
Entonces,
is to
yo
ensure
me
that
atrevo
companies
a
are all
preguntar,
receiving
sin
what
dejar
they
de
need.
lado lo
So,
que
of
han
course,
dicho mis
without
colegas,
putting to the
el
side the
tema de
important
la
points
calidad de
mentioned by
quienes
my
están
co-panelists, I would
prestando los
say
servicios
the
y los que
quality
están
of the service
operándolos.
providers is
Y como tú
incredibly
decías,
important because
Carolina,
they're
no
operating the
solamente
system.
en
And as you
un
said,
contexto de
Carolina,
pago por resultados, sino en
it's not
general en
only
toda la
in terms
oferta que
of
tenemos
payment
para la
for results,
empleabilidad en esta
it's really when
categoría,
it comes
es
to
algo
how
muy
we
relevante.
address
Y le
employability
apunta
in the
a lo que nos
secretariat.
permitió a nosotros
And
institucionalizar este
this
mecanismo,
is
y
what
es
enabled us
un
to
uso más eficiente
institutionalize this
y
mechanism
transparente
because we are
de
talking
los
about
recursos, que
more
también es algo que
transparent and
menciona Karen.
efficient use
Entonces,
of
cuando nosotros tenemos
resources.
calidad,
When we have
operamos con
quality,
transformaciones reales tanto para los
we end
buscadores
up
de
with
empleo como
real
para las
transformations for
empresas.
job seekers
Somos
as well
más
as for
eficientes en el uso de
companies.
los recursos y
We are more
podemos también
efficient
rendir cuentas de
in
una manera
our
más
resource use,
transparente.
and we can also have greater
Muchísimas gracias
accountability.
por
Thank
el
you very
espacio.
much
De
for
verdad,
joining
tienes toda la
us.
razón. Incluso en el tema de pago por resultados, que es
That
un
is
instrumento
spot
que a
on.
veces sirve, a veces
Payment for
no.
results is a
Pero en uno de los
mechanism
casos
that
en el que
sometimes works and
pues
sometimes
necesita ser
doesn't.
unos
But of
calidad para
course,
los operadores,
we
porque
need to ensure
si todos
minimum
son
quality of
iguales
operators.
operadores en el caso extremo, aunque
Because
los que se
let's say in an
tienen, pues el
extreme
trabajo
case that all the
necesariamente
operators
no van a
were
poder ser
offering
capaces de
very poor
entregar un buen
quality, they
servicio.
will not be able to deliver a
Muchísimas
good
gracias.
service.
Lamento mucho que había unas preguntas muy interesantes en
Thank
el
you very much
panel.
again for
Muchas
being
gracias a
here. I am
todos por el
sorry that
espacio.
we didn't get to everybody's questions. We're at the
Entiendo
end
que
of our
ya
session.
nos extendimos como 5 minutos,
I
así
know
que
we've already
gracias a los
gone
que
5 minutes
siguen
over
aquí.
time, so thank you
Y
for
por
those
supuesto
for staying with us.
a Karen, a
So
Juan y a
thank you,
Viviana
Karen, thank you, Juan,
por su
thank you,
tiempo, por su
Bibiana, for your
generosidad
time,
y
for your
por habernos
generosity,
acompañado.
and for having joined us today.
Gracias.
Thank you very much.
Aquí
Thanks
está
for
el
the great
webinar,
discussions.
perdón, si quieren escanear el código y evaluar.
Before we leave, if you
los
wouldn't mind
resultados,
scanning this QR
muchísimas
code
gracias a los que
to have
puedan,
your opinion on how this
participar
webinar
en la
went, that would be
encuesta, y
great.
gracias a todos.
And again, thank you everybody for being here.